We're going to finish up the endocrine unit here, and I'm just going to go into some detail on the different glands that make up the endocrine system. Like I said before, this is not the entirety of the endocrine system. These are the major glands. There are lots of different hormones that are produced by lots of different types of cells, but we're just going to focus on the main structures that are really responsible for most of the major hormone production in the body. And the first one is called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is often referred to as being the master gland. And that's because it really is. It controls the other glands of the body. So let's talk a little bit about that. So for one thing, it's tiny. It's only 1 centimeter in diameter, and it's right at the base of the brain. So it sits right below the hypothalamus. And it's attached to the hypothalamus by a little structure called the infundibulum. And the infundibulum is basically just the connection between the hypothalamus, which would be here, and then the pituitary gland sits right below it. And the pituitary gland is really controlled by the hypothalamus. So I've talked about the hypothalamus a lot in here. It's like the thermostat of the body. It controls, it's not just the thermostat with temperature. It's really keeping track of all of your homeostatic. Blood passes through there, and it keeps track of blood sugar, keeps track of body temperature. And it's going to then trigger the pituitary gland to then release different hormones to initiate some responses in the body. And it's really broken into 2 parts. There's going to be your anterior lobe and then your posterior lobe. So your anterior lobe is really responsible for producing a handful of hormones: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. Now, again, there's never going to be a situation where I'm like, what are the names of the hormones that the anterior pituitary gland produces? I'm just going to go through them a little bit just to give you an idea of the impact of this gland. And then the posterior lobe is separate. It's actually a separate part of it, and that doesn't actually make any hormones. It has 2 neurons that go into there, and they produce the hormones, which is very odd. Most hormones are produced by glands. These are neurons, and when you have a neuron releasing something, it's considered a neurotransmitter. But because these are hormones that leave and go somewhere else, so that just shows you that a lot of this is semantics. The difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter is really just where it is and what it does. But they both do the same thing, essentially. They both unlock some kind of a protein receptor. But the posterior lobe makes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And this is all controlled by the hypothalamus. So here's just an image to show you. This is your anterior lobe, and this is your posterior lobe. The anterior lobe does, it is going to synapse with some neurons, but those neurons are then going to trigger hormone production. If you look at the posterior lobe here, you can see that these neurons are coming all the way from the thalamus down through the hypothalamus, and that's going to come into the pituitary gland, and this is what actually produces the hormones. So the hormones are produced in the anterior pituitary gland, but in the posterior, they're actually produced by the neurons. Again, this is a long list, but these are all the different hormones produced by the pituitary gland. Growth hormone is going to trigger growth, right? That's what makes your body grow. We talked about that with the skeletal unit. It's what triggers the growth plates to grow. Your prolactin is going to produce milk production, so that's going to be in females, and in males it actually controls the production of sperm. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to trigger the thyroid to function, and adrenocorticotropic is going to control the adrenal gland, so that's going to trigger the adrenal gland to produce its hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to cause your the female to produce more eggs, the males produce more sperm, and luteinizing hormone is going to produce more sex hormones. So that's going to trigger the release of estrogen and testosterone. So when I say the master gland, this is considered the master gland because these hormones trigger these other glands to produce hormones. So it's like it's one thing triggers the next. And then the last 2 are going to be from your posterior, and that's going to be antidiuretic, which controls how much water is in your body. Do you want to urinate more or less? It controls your kidneys. And then oxytocin is connected to milk production, and also it's what triggers contraction of the uterine wall during pregnancy, or during birth, I should say, not during pregnancy. The thyroid gland. Let's go through the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is really just 2 separate lobes, which are connected in the middle by this thing called an isthmus. And this is going to be just below the larynx, so it's inferior to the larynx. And basically, if you've ever noticed before, look in your house at some point after you watch this and try to find the salt that you have in your house. And what you should see is on the salt it says iodized salt. Most salt is iodized, which means they add iodine to it. And the reason why they add iodine to it is because of your thyroid gland. Your thyroid gland needs iodine to make its hormones. And it does that by pulling the iodine from the blood. So if you don't have enough iodine in your system, your body can't produce the hormones it needs. So that's when they started adding iodine to salt, which is pretty cool actually. All right, this is just an image of the thyroid gland. You can see it's got the two sides, and that's that isthmus. Let's talk a little bit about how it's set up. So basically, you have these cells, these epithelial cells, which produce the hormones, and then you have these things called colloid. And colloid is basically this thick fluid. It's a clear fluid that pools up in the center of your thyroid, and that is essentially where these hormones are going to pool up. So basically, these cells, these are called follicular cells. That's just the term for it. They're follicles. And they produce the hormones, and they get stored in the colloid until they're needed. So think of them as like reservoirs for this hormone. And mainly, the colloid's made up of this glycoprotein. We talked about glycoproteins. That's going to be your protein, which is connected by a carbohydrate called thyroglobulin. So thyroglobulin is going to be held in here. And let's talk a little bit more about that, though. So there's really 4 hormones that get produced by the thyroid gland. I'm sorry, 3 hormones. There's thyroxine, which is going to be regulating your carbohydrates, lipids, and protein metabolism. So people that have issues with their thyroid sometimes gain weight, right? You've heard people say that before, I have thyroid problems. It's because that controls how much energy gets released by your carbohydrates and how much the rate of protein synthesis, how much are you making proteins. So if, it's really what controls your metabolism. So as you eat food, how does your body break that food down and convert it into usable proteins? That's all done because of this thyroid hormone. So if your thyroid hormones aren't working correctly, you're going to hold on to that weight. You're not going to be using it the way you need to. So that's where issues with the thyroid. The next hormone is kind of a mouthful. It's called triiodothyronine. And basically, it's just a more potent version of thyroxine. Most of your hormone is this thyroxine, and the difference is the number of iodine. So thyroxine has 4, triiodothyronine, which again, every time I say it, it's a handful. Tri refers to 3 iodine. And then finally, calcitonin we've talked about before when we talked about the skeletal system. Calcitonin is what controls how much calcium is in your blood, and it's triggers bone growth. We talked about that idea of calcitonin is going to, if you have higher levels of calcium in your blood, it's going to trigger more osteoblast activity to build that calcium into bone. That's triggered by calcitonin. And if, again, we talked about this before, it decreased osteoclast activity and increases osteoblast activity. It's what allows you to take that calcium and store it in your bones. And parathyroid hormone, basically what the parathyroid is it's 4 small structures on the back of the thyroid. That's why it's called para. It means next to. Para means next to. And basically that produces parathyroid hormone, which does the opposite of calcitonin. It increases your blood calcium concentration. So it's the opposite effect of calcitonin. It increases your osteoclast activity and decreases your osteoblast activity. Let's keep moving here. I'm going quickly, but I'm just trying to get through this stuff. All right, the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidney. We have 2 of them. We have 2 kidneys, and we have 2 adrenal glands. And they are basically, they have 2 different components, which, are called the medulla and the cortex. So your cortex is the outside, and the medulla is the inside. And they both produce just different types of hormones. So that's the big distinction between them. So the medulla hormones are going to be epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's what's in the middle, and that is going to basically what triggers the fight or flight response. So that's what triggers when you think of your heart rate going up, your digestive, feeling queasy, your digestive system shuts down, your eyes dilate, you're basically getting ready to fight or run. That is caused by epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're essentially the same thing. They're different versions of the same molecule. We have mostly epinephrine, a small percentage is norepinephrine. And actually, epinephrine becomes norepinephrine. And then the cortex hormones are going to be the ones that are the outside of the adrenal gland. The outer portion, the cortex, produces these 3 hormones: aldosterone, cortisol, and then the sex hormones. Now, aldosterone and cortisol are extremely important for that homeostasis that we've been talking about. It causes you to have the right amount of ions. So if you think back to the neuron and how we have sodium, potassium, right? Sodium and potassium have to be in certain concentrations to function. That's what aldosterone does. It causes your kidneys to either hold on to sodium or get rid of potassium. Sorry. I'm in school. And then cortisol is an interesting one. Cortisol gets released under times of stress. And what cortisol does is it causes you to stop making proteins, and it causes you to start burning fat. And it's so you can react. It's, you know, if you're in a high stress situation, you want to be able to react and have energy. So it's going to increase how much sugar's in your blood. It's going to increase your glucose blood levels so your cells have energy. And it's going to cause you to start burning some more fat, so your cells have energy, and you're going to not make as many proteins because that takes energy. It costs energy to make proteins. So essentially, it's a switch that causes your body to start being ready to react. Now, if you have too much cortisol, it causes some serious problems. So people that are constantly under stress have higher cortisol levels. It causes some long-term effects. And then finally, your sex hormones, you know, your gonads, the testes and the ovaries are really where these get produced, but you make some of those sex hormones in your adrenal glands. Not sure why. I don't know why that would be the case. I guess, you know, if you need some extra. All right. And pancreas. The pancreas is an interesting organ because it is actually lives in two different systems. It is in the digestive system because it actually makes enzymes which break down fats. So it's part of your digestive system. It sits right next to the small intestines. So it's going to produce those enzymes, and they're going to go directly into the small intestines, and it's going to break down fats. That's responsible for that. But it also releases hormones, and those hormones are going to go into the blood as well. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then basically this is the actual organ here. You can see it's got these vessels, and then the cells around it are called pancreatic islets. So that's just a term that you might want to be familiar with. All right, and the pancreatic islets are what make the hormones, and it makes two hormones really. Actually, I'm sorry, it makes three hormones. The first two we talked about, glucagon and insulin. Glucagon causes the liver to break down glycogen and release it. So when you have not enough blood sugar, it's going to cause the liver to release glycogen back into the blood so you have access to it. So glucagon would be like if you haven't had a meal for a little bit, your glucagon will get released to cause more blood sugar. And then insulin gets released to cause, when your blood sugar is too high, if you eat a big meal, insulin is going to cause that extra sugar to get stored as glycogen. And then somatostatin really is involved in just regulating both of those. So somatostatin is really just on top of either inhibiting glucagon or insulin. So when the levels go up, somatostatin is going to get released and bring insulin back down. So that's that negative feedback we were talking about. And finally, we're just about done here, the other glands of the endocrine system. Just real quick, your pineal gland is really, that's going to be in the diencephalon in the middle of the brain. That is what produces melatonin. And melatonin is what controls your sleep cycles. So it's released in the dark. It's not released in the light. It's what makes you feel sleepy. We talked about that already. The thymus actually is going to we talked about the thymus in terms of making T cells. Well, that is done because of this hormone called thymosins. So thymosins essentially are what trigger the maturing of these T cells so we can have our helper T cells. And that's done in the thymus. The testes produce testosterone. The ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, which are going to be the males and females have both of these. Males and females have testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. It's just that females have more estrogen and males have more testosterone. And then finally, the placenta, which is really only exists when a woman is pregnant. That's what is it's giving the baby its nutrients, and that also produces estrogen, progesterone, and gonadotropin, which are going to be involved in pregnancy and giving the baby what it needs to start to develop. So that is the endocrine system in a very brief nutshell. Thank you very much.